Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you may be. Welcome back to the Asia Solidarity Lab plenary panels. My name is Beatriz Talagan, and I'm the Asia Regional Organizer of 350.org. I'll be your moderator once again for this session. This session is called Sowing Hope through Narrative, Culture, and Storytelling. And I'm joined here today by my colleagues working as journalists, curators, activists, and storytellers to talk about the role of culture and stories in building hope across movements and guiding us through visions for the future. We have Mio Neidhart joining us from Japan. Mio is 17 years old and a high school student who joined the Japanese Fridays for Future movement at the beginning of 2020. Today, Mio also works at a new project to set the climate clock in Tokyo. Thank you, Mio, for joining us today. We also have Nanticha Ocharonchai. Sorry. We also have sorry. We also have Nanticha or Lynn Ocharonchai joining us from Thailand. Lynn is an environmental writer and climate activist who started the climate strike movement in Thailand, referred to as Climate Strike Thailand. She is also a communications consultant for an international environmental NGO. Lynn is well recognized for her storytelling, which integrates humor and the human spirit into communications about environmental science and solutions. She puts this means to great use, whether via the written word, through films or photography, to widen awareness and action in Thailand and around the world, using mediums and language which attract and connect various demographics. Lynn also lends her expertise to other organizations and publications such as Greenpeace, WWF, Mongabay.com, and SOS Earth, to name a few. Thank you for being here, Lynn. Our third panelist is Walter Tupaz. Joining us from the Philippines, Walter is the president of the multimedia production startup Life, which he co-founded in 2018. He also serves as the chief content officer of the group's independent media outfit, Fight, which creates digital content, promotes community journalism, and highlights courage and stories. As a multimedia journalist, he covers climate change, environment, and humanitarian issues. He wrote and produced 360 Perspective, Women of the Mountains, which won Best Immersive 360 VR at the regional round of the Asian Academy Creative Awards 2019. Walter is also a director of the National Union of Journalists of the Philippines and the digital information specialist of the Initiative for Media Freedom, the consortium behind the Barangay Hub.ph platform and network. Before that, Walter was the editor of MovePH, Rappler's civic engagement arm. A founding team member of Rappler in 2012, he steered award-winning digital campaigns and platforms such as Not on Our Watch or Now PH, Climate Action PH, and Aguas Ibayanihan until 2018. Walter's passion for storytelling and civic engagement was inspired by his extensive experience as a youth leader and development worker. Thank you for joining us today, Walter. So let's get to it. I'm so excited to hear from our panelists today. So my first question is for Mio. During the previous panel, we had two amazing youth climate activists like you and Lynn who spoke about what they needed out of mentors to build a regenerative climate movement. What I realize now is I never got to ask them how they got into climate activism in the first place and what the role of culture and storytelling is in that decision. So what is your story, Mio? How did you get into activism, and what's the role of stories in that?
So first of all, I always really loved the sea, the ocean, and I love the animals in the ocean. And then my grandma from China once told me that there are these pink dolphins in the river somewhere in China. I don't remember, but so there are only two of them left, I think, because the rivers are so dirty. And then that was, I think, the first time I got to know that nature is getting polluted. But after that, I kind of forgot it because I went to school and nobody talked about that in Japan. And then I moved to the German school in Japan I'm currently going to. And the German school curriculum is built very so you really talk about the topic of climate change in class in every subject. When you, for example, learn English, when we learn English in school, for example, we, there are these stories in the textbooks, and then you have to like handle a topic and talk about the topic, and these topics are often related to climate change. So when we do biology or when we do English in school, the lessons are in German then. And then we often talk about climate change, and then I kind of got to know that there's this problem, but I then still didn't know how severe it is. But then I think it's 2018 or 2019 when Greta started the school strike in when Greta Thunberg, I don't know how to pronounce the name in English, Thunberg, started the school strikes on Friday. The students in Germany kind of really started to get into the movement, and then they really massively were on the streets and boycotting school. And but that was not a movement at all in Japan. But luckily, because we are international school, the students around me started to go to the street on Fridays too, instead of going to school. And then I kind of got to know about the movement. And then my geography teacher once asked if we want to go to a demonstration as a class, and she was kind of the person who got me into this whole thing. And then she asked if the whole class wants to skip class on that day and go to the demonstration that is happening in Tokyo. So we went there, and then there I met an activist from Japan, and then I kind of got to know her, and then she invited me to her house where there were still where there were other activists too. That was before COVID. And then I started to research myself, and then I got to know how in what a critical situation we are. And there was also an organizer from Fridays for Future, and then she told me that as a student you could that there's a student organization that just started in Japan, which was then the Fridays for Future Japan. So I joined. Yeah. And since then I'm a member of it.
What a wonderful story. It's really inspiring how different and also very similar the stories of youth activists are, in that we're always inspired by another activist or organizer to take up the cause. And yeah, I think that that is what gives us courage to actually move forward with their own activism. So my next question is for Voltaire. Tell us a little bit about FYP Fight, whose tagline is Courage in Stories, and how you've been working to tell stories not just about impacts but also solutions. The IPCC report just came out of this month, so that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Climate Science report, and brought us sobering news about the state of our climate. How does your team sow hope in storytelling?
Well, good morning, no reference. Good morning or good evening? Well, it's good
Good
evening.
afternoon. Yeah,
Good
I will.
afternoon.
Yeah.
Good evening from Leyte. Good afternoon wherever you are. If this will be aired in the afternoon, I'm in Leyte now because of the lockdown. Fight is a new multimedia organization. It's an independent media, which I co-founded with other friends, journalist friends, from mainstream media, online, TV, broadcast, and also print, and from advocacy groups. I myself came from an NGO before I became a journalist. Um, we gathered and tried to brainstorm on how to enhance not only our communications, but also ways of telling the stories of communities who are often not reached by mainstream media, because we know how it works, because we came from big news organizations. I came from a big startup, Rappler, and we knew how difficult it is to cover ground zero during disasters, environmental issues, issues of indigenous peoples. So we thought of creating a platform for these communities whose stories are often untold. And we are trying to cater to young audiences, millennials in the communities, and also in urban areas. So it's a digital platform. We create explainers, mini documentaries, inspiring stories from the communities, mainly covering climate change, disasters, environmental issues, issues of marginalized sectors like indigenous peoples, and other concerns of young people. So that's our goal, really to produce cutting edge content, hopefully to reach the younger generation who are so into online platforms. And we think we can provide alternative content for them, not only to consume, but also to spark conversations, to engage them, and hopefully to jolt them into action.
Thank
Oh,
you so much for there. My next question is actually for Lynn and relates a lot to what Voltaire said about community storytelling, right? So, as a youth activist, Lynn, who is also working on climate and cultural storytelling, I realize, well, we all realize that the media doesn't always center stories of frontline activists, especially those from the global south. So, how can we center community stories in the climate narrative? And how do you personally ensure that you also tell the stories of people who are not always making the headlines?
So first of all, thank you for having me here. It's good to be speaking about this stuff. You know, it's really important. But in terms of centering communities in climate narratives, I do feel as doing journalism or writing stories of my own. What I've found is that a lot of the barrier lies in language, like language barrier as well as charisma. As journalists, as writers, or as filmmakers, we often want interesting characters. And, to be completely honest with it, like you want a story that wows. And oftentimes, mainstream media chooses to do what would be easiest. They choose like one single character. They choose someone who speaks well and like really gets their story through and, has this um, one stop story to tell, and they don't have to do further work on it. And so I feel like that's one obstacle where I think journalists or the media have to actually work harder to get that kind of information. Our job is to share these stories, and whether that be given to us easily or whether we should dig for it. And so that comes a lot from doing good research, a lot from asking the right questions, to really allow these people not to write these stories for them and oftentimes romanticize about things. There's even, I'm speaking for myself as well, where I, with climate narratives, a lot of times we want to exaggerate things to make it either really really optimistic or really really pessimistic, like, oh my god, the world's going to blow up, or this community is doing great, they're changing the world, which oftentimes is not the case, because you've got these local communities, they create incremental change, and that's necessary. That kind of process is what's so essential to our stories, because you want people to know that change doesn't come easy, it doesn't come overnight. So with that, you have to maintain some kind of authenticity, and that requires you're as media, I feel like you should put your craft into writing and shaping and crafting those stories and extracting them, but then ultimately you want your goal to be allowing the communities to speak for themselves, whether that be in their own language, their own way of speaking, or through you. But just making sure that you get the facts right, you get what their needs are, what their problems are, what their solutions are as well. Or sometimes you have these communities with climate change. I've been to one where they're facing sea level rise, and as going into there wanting like to cover a good story, you go in and you want this like dramatic thing to happen. But I ask the communities, and there's like, honestly, it the sea is rising. We don't really mind so much anymore. We've accepted it. So that kind of opinion is really important as well. And yeah, just making sure that we tell these stories because the communities who own these stories want it to be shared in that way.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And Lynn spoke to this a little bit, but my question is both for Mio and Voltaire. Maybe Mio can go first. And it's about what is the hardest story you've had to write or tell about climate change, or what are the obstacles you confront as storytellers? Maybe for Mio, as someone who is a storyteller about the movement you're part of, and maybe for Voltaire as a storyteller by profession. So maybe Mio can go first about the obstacles.
I think the thing the people are most shocked about is how little time we have. So until we arrive the 1.5 degrees tipping point, the newest IPCC even said that it might be this year, but before this report came out, we still thought that we had about 6 years. And I was once talking to middle school students in their school, and me myself, I'm 17 now, so I will be 23 in 6 years. But they were like 3 or 4 years younger than me, so they will be maybe 20 years old. And when they kind of realize that they're that the whole climate change thing is not about the far future, but like, when they're 20 years old, so when they just start with university, they kind of were really shocked. And we have this one girl in our Fridays for Future movement. She's also 14, I think. And she was crying the other day saying, yeah, all these teachers and my parents and everybody who asked me what I want to do in the future, so what job I want to do and so on. And they're kind of like smiling and talking as if we have a lot of hope in the future. But then I have the feeling that they're taking my future away, kind of. And then she was crying in front of me, and that was pretty hard to watch. And when you have to give this shock on to for people to realize how big the problem is, it's pretty hard, because especially young people then can't imagine that it is so close. I mean, that the problem is so in their daily life.
Thank you, Mio. And Voltaire?
The toughest story that I covered, usually it's a disaster situation, and it has to be Super Typhoon Yolanda, Super Typhoon Haiyan. It was so tough. It was my first time to cover a huge disaster, and I was with an online news organization, and then it was tough in a sense that very well, personally and professionally. Professionally, because I really didn't know how to cover disasters, and then all of a sudden when I arrived on ground zero, you see lifeless bodies and along the road from the coastal village of ground zero to downtown Tacloban in Leyte. You would see dead bodies wrapped in cloth, mats, and sacks which rot. So can you imagine the situation on the ground at that time? And then I I had met, mothers were crying because their husbands were missing and their children died. And then I met one woman, and she said that I mean, she was begging every reporter she would meet, asking them to tell her story. She was trying to convey a message to her children in Manila, to calm them down and then to assure them that she's alive. But of course, every reporter has to deal with, with all these stories around. People were hungry, no food, no water, and then the mismanagement of disaster was also worse in the situation. And um, and then another woman literally had to feed um, food for the pigs, feed her children with food for the pigs because there was no food available and water. So there were times when I would just cry, and then but I had to tell the story. So it was tough because I had to shoot. I was a one-man team. I would write, shoot, and then edit, and then send to my news organization. I would run to shoot these bodies wrapped in mats because there were no um, and they were not buried yet because they were literally all around the place. And so the trauma, the smell, the stench of death. I think that was the title of my story, The Stench of Death in Tacloban. I would run and shoot for 5 seconds and then run again to a place because it's really, when you smell the stench of dead bodies and all, it's really overwhelming. And then it's horrifying, the scene around you. And that was the situation for days, for weeks. And there was no electricity, so that was even tougher. No water. We did not take a bath for days. No food. And then on top of that, I had to look for my family because my family lives here. And it took me a week to reach my town, to make sure that my family, my mom, my two aunties, my sister and her baby, um, to I was not even sure about their situation because the communication was cut at the time. So it was really difficult um, for us reporters covering that huge disasters that happened in our place, in our country. And until now, I think it's still very traumatic. But there were also days when some of our stories were inspiring also, like because there was no communication. The woman I talked to, the first my first interviewee on the ground, who was begging for an audience with reporters, was trying to be interviewed. I interviewed her, found her finally, and then told me her story, and then wrote about her plight. She needed medicines, she needed food and water, and then she wrote on a piece of paper the name of her daughter, and then I took a picture of her with that piece of paper, and then that was my main photo. And then her daughter, who was in Manila, apparently was really looking for signs of life, um, you know, whether her family members were alive. And so you can imagine how they got reconnected through my story. And it was just one of the inspiring moments, that even in dark times, even when there's no communication, no power, information will always find its way to those who need them. And they can connect people, even um, if there's no electricity, no power, no interconnection, no internet connection. But it's through storytelling. That's the power of storytelling. It connects people, it moves people to act, it tells the story of those who are affected by climate change, by disasters. So I think that was a pretty long story. It's still vivid in my mind.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Walter. Can imagine that is very tough for you even after all these years. And that actually leads me to my next question, which I think you can answer first before I hand it over to Lynn and Leo. I realize, and with the coming out of the IPCC report and all the disaster reporting that our journalists, our storytellers have to do, that you carry this burden, because it's not always easy to remain hopeful when
Mm,
scientific data tells us
mm,
grim
mm,
details about the next few years. So how do you
mm,
combat the trauma, the grief, everything the being human behind it all, behind being a
Mm.
journalist, being a photographer or whatnot. How do you combat that and manage to still focus on storytelling, what needs to be done?
You have to remember that even if we receive figures, facts and figures from international organizations, the UN, that these figures, these numbers represent human beings. One number represents one human being. So you have to tell the story of that person. That's the main purpose of journalism, of storytelling. So, and you have to convey that um, through your video, through your photo, through your text stories. So that's your main purpose. So what I do is from the get-go, it had to be very clear from me as a journalist, as a content creator, the emotion that I'll convey, the emotion that my readers or my viewers will feel from the time from the start to finish, from start to finish. um, because that's your responsibility. There are competing content and forms of content online. So your first word, your first line has to capture their attention, their emotion. It's usually their emotion. People don't usually um, are not usually captured by numbers. Even if they're big numbers, emotions get your attention, get people's attention. So online, usually it's either the inspirational, the inspiring ones, or stories that anger you. These are the stories that often get viral. So I start with stories that make people feel either inspired, or if sad, you have to make sure that you close the loop. Meaning, at the end of your story, if it will make people worry, if it will cause fear, you have to make sure that there's a call to action, some form um, of of action that will encourage the reader, the viewer, to help, to move, or to resolve a problem on the ground. Otherwise, you will be wasting the emotion that you evoke. If a person is inspired to help, and then and at the end of the story, you did not give an alternative, a platform, or a call to action, that wastes the attention, no, that you were able to gain through your storytelling. So, in other words, when you tell your stories, it has to be planned from start to finish. Um, all the elements, from the words, the photos, and the video, it has to come together, and with the purpose of giving justice to the story of your interviewees, of the people on the ground, because they are rarely covered. Their stories are not often told. So it would be a waste of opportunity if we will do it without rigor nor passion. You have to plan your stories. All the elements must come together, from the video to photos to text, and the execution online, and the nature of your platform, because it would be a waste of time and effort and opportunity to educate, to raise awareness, to reach more people, if you will not give justice to the stories of those who are affected by climate change. They are rarely heard, they are rarely seen, and every story must count and must make an impact as much as possible.
Thank you so much, Voltaire. How about you, Lynn?
I mean, just coming back to, how just reading a lot of news, and it's always bad news these days, it seems, but it's actually not like that. It's kind of sad to see how the media and social media particularly has really shaped our perception of the world. And honestly, for myself, I don't really know exactly the situation of the world right now, whether in social or environmental issues, it's honestly like really hard to tell whether that's just what your social media feed has been, shaped to show you from based on your algorithms, or whether that's the reality of the world. But my way of dealing it, I learned this the hard way, because when I started my climate activism, it took me maybe half a year before really falling into depression, because it was that became your reality. Every day you're working with these numbers, with this kind of goal to basically save the world from its doomsday. And I remember for a certain period, I'd wake up every day, just feeling extremely terrified, and having that specific year in mind of, I think it was 2050, where I thought as soon as it was Happy New Year 2050, and the world would just kind of blow up. And that was my reality for a while, which was really unhealthy and dangerous. And I'd go to sleep with that in mind as well. So that was not good at all, until one day I realized it was just really bad for my mental health. And I just decided to stop caring so much about it, honestly. It's not great to say as a climate activist or a climate journalist, but sometimes I think it's really necessary to step away from that space and focus on what you can actually do. So my kind of mindset with it right now is like, I've honestly like stopped looking at the numbers so much, because as much as these news or new reports, new research comes out, and maybe 1 year ago, that's when I already learned the extent of how bad it was. Personally, I don't want to know anymore. I don't really. I'm motivated enough by that extent of threat, that I look forward to doing what I do, and doing it in the best way I can. Whether it's in conservation or storytelling. I just needed that piece of bad news, and that's enough for me, because any more bad numbers, I don't know what the point is for me in reading it. It just deteriorates my mental health. And unless of course it's numbers to help you like analyzing the issue to better solve a crisis. But just consume what is necessary for you. And for me, I'd recommend just staying focused on what you do. Even if our world blows up, we die, everyone's bound to die. The best thing we will just do the best that you can, and then that's great. And I think also for me, another way to look at it is as seeing this problem more so as a challenge, like a fun challenge. Don't get so affixated on fixing or solving the issue, but rather like providing and offering these wonderful solutions to the world. Like, don't think about how you can make it less worse, but maybe think about like, how can I make my world better today? And I feel like I kind of wake up, really motivated and looking forward to every morning, because I'm just like, oh wow, there's so many problems in the world. Like, what can I do to change this? So yeah, and I guess in that creating this fun, one of the best ways to do it too is to do it with friends. And I only discovered this after a year of doing climate activism, because I've always been pretty like a lone wolf. I don't work with so many people. I don't have so many friends. And so when I started climate activism, that was when the circle started forming around me. And that was really great, to meet like-minded people who were really motivated as well, as you. And when you look around you, from before, when you get out the house and you don't really have the same like-minded people, you might think like, oh, the world is so bad, no one cares. But then when you find these little, groups of people around in your communities, it's really empowering. It really feels like, wow, I'm not alone after all. Like, people do care, people are working towards it. And when you kind of bounce back off each other, especially with people who can be more creative, or people with different sets of skills or multidisciplinary expertise, there's so much that happens with collaboration, with like bouncing off of ideas, and also supporting each other. So yeah, I think that's my way to go about the climate activism world in a century of many doomsdays.
Thank you, Lynn. There's definitely wisdom in, knowing your own boundaries, and, taking care of yourself and taking
Mm.
care of your collective, your groups. How about you, Mio? How do you combat all the doomsday messaging, and manage to still focus on what needs to be done?
After I started, I actually never fell into depression, but my day was basically back then like I go to school, I come back, I attend 3 or 4 meetings, and then I sleep. So I actually didn't do anything else. That was like everything I had in mind, and I was kind of stressed. And then after a month or two, I kind of flipped. I kind of fell out of the movement. I stopped attending the meetings, and then I had a few weeks of like a time slot where I did nothing for the climate because I just couldn't deal with it anymore, because that was kind of everything I had in my daily life. And then I thought about why I actually do this activism, and then I noticed that I actually do it so that we have a happy life. So it doesn't really make sense if I lose my happy life to get a happy life. You know what I mean? So then I kind of have to find a balance that how to, as Lynn said, enjoy what I'm doing and kind of don't let it take my whole life. So then I'm not into the activism that much anymore actually, but instead I started to do like new projects, for example the climate clock, that so I enjoy doing that project. And I don't know, probably you enjoy a project when you see the good outcomes. And with the climate clock, for example, I see how people then come to me and say, thanks to this number, I noticed how important this problem is. Or when my story was once told on TV, and then people that didn't have anything to do with the problem before kind of contacted me and said, oh yeah, thanks to you, I noticed how that we are in a critical time. So I'm not going to join the activism. I can't, because I'm too overwhelmed with my daily life, but I will try to do the best I could, or kind of these things. And then I noticed that when you kind of have these small success feelings, you get the motivation to go on even when it gets hard. And it's also good to share these success feelings with the people around you, because I kind of think that everyone in doing the climate activism have these up and downs, because it is a hard topic. You don't see the goal. And yeah, so the 3 things basically for me is, first of all, to do the things I enjoy and kind of spend time with my friends and my family, and forgetting the climate issue from time to time. And the second thing is to have these small success feelings. And the third thing is to work with people you like, and with the people you could share your up and downs and kind of motivate each other to go through. Yeah.
I think, yeah, if I may add quickly, that was an important point to make, because the scale of the problem is so huge. So you have to manage the scale of your intervention. Um, well, I think I'm the oldest in the group, so I think I've been through a lot. So that's what I do. I just manage my intervention. What can I do best at my level? What can I do as a journalist, or maybe as an activist? And then in your own circle, what can you do to influence that circle, your immediate circle? Then how can you spark conversations and create ripples to influence other circles and to create more ripples? So I think we have to stop trying to be the Messiah, our messianic complex, but we have to trust in the movements. That is a collective action of the people. You have to trust in the movement. It's not only you. It's a shared commitment, a shared cause. And then two, you have to trust your immediate community. Start from your community, and then draw inspiration from that by telling their stories, by campaigning with them, and then this will create ripples, and then the trickle down effect will be felt in the long run. Know what's short term and what's long term. What can you do within your means and your time constraints, so that you will not be unnecessarily burdened. It's stressful because you're dealing with climate change. I mean, it's a worldwide problem. It's an existential problem. You can't solve it alone. So do what you can do best based on your capacity, and then excel, and then try to unwind from time to time, and then relax, and then process. You have to process because we can only absorb so much. Numbers can be so can overwhelming, and then so always try to remember that every number represents a story, and you have to tell that story through campaigns or through your articles or your content. And always remember that your hardship, our hardship is nothing compared to the misery of the people who are vulnerable, who are affected by climate change. So you have to continue. We should not despair.
Thank you so much, Walter. I think that's a really great note to close with. Trust in movements, trust your community, do what you do best, but learn your boundaries. And I think that's really the role of storytelling. What matters is really the stories we tell each other as much as stories we put out into the world. Yeah, thank you so much to all our panelists. It's been a pleasure hearing from you, learning from you, and to all our participants. Please follow them on their social media accounts. You'll get to read their articles, their work. You can follow their work. And yeah, I'll see you at the next panel of the Asia Solidarity Lab. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.